you'll see in every newspaper, magazines, repeated, everyone saying fantastic talk and really made sense. And even people that you respect are saying that this is the science. Why would we want to discount the science? And this is the proper way to do it. And there'll be at the same time people continuing to doing medicine circles and kind of mixing in with it in indigenous knowledge, and some of those scientists are doing the same thing, and they're picking up the cultural ways of respecting indigenous knowledge and reciprocity, and but up to a point, because the power structure of science, corporatism, and the way we live in the West, no matter it seems to be hurtling towards some kind of devastating conclusion, that's still seen as this is the best way, this is the only way we can do it.
Hey everyone, it's Ollie chatting with Giulio again, as we like to do, having these interesting, irreverent conversations, which yeah, take a critical look at what's going on in the psychedelic space. And I think just going off the back of a post that we saw on LinkedIn from an individual called George Monty, who I've connected with, and I've actually appeared on his podcast a couple of times, and we've really resonated on a lot of views surrounding the wider societal issues of psychedelics, particularly the creativity, a lot of positive conversation surrounding creative output and this kind of slightly maverick mindset within the psychedelic space. But he interestingly put up a post that was being critical of the microdosing coach phenomena. And I think the interesting thing was that he named people specifically. And even though he only used first names, it's a small enough community to know who he's referring to. And actually, these people were party to seeing his post on LinkedIn, and it caused a lot of discussion. And I find it interesting because I'm being in the functional mushroom space. A lot of people in the US are talking to me from the microdosing space because they're like, oh, we need to find ways we can collaborate and bring in the functional mushrooms to the microdosing space. And I don't know whether the microdosing coaches are necessarily the biggest issue, because from my perspective, look, if someone wants to pay lots of money for someone to tell them how to take small amounts of mushrooms, like, okay, fine. If they've got the money to do that, I will always say, if you haven't got the money to do that, here's how you can grow your own mushrooms and take them yourself and microdose. So I think if if people are willing to pay thousands of dollars to train up to be a coach for something which has limited potential for negative experiences, because if you're only taking small doses of mushrooms, then the chances of having a bad trip are probably quite mitigated. So being a microdosing coach, you're not necessarily lending yourself to the same types of pitfalls that psychedelic therapists might be lend themselves to. And I do just think, and I have been critical of that side of the industry, but also the more that I interact with these microdosing coaches, I just think, well, they're maybe not the people to be turning the attention to when there is so much dominance from maps and Atai Life Sciences and Compass and these big behemoths with huge amounts of money, who are kind of directing the wider narrative. I don't know. I don't know. We haven't necessarily spoken that much about the microdosing phenomena. I guess because we're not allowed to do it in the UK officially, so we're not maybe coming up against that side of the industry. And interestingly, that's where I found that slight wiggle room is, well, okay, I can't advise people on psychedelic mushrooms, but I can certainly talk to people about functional mushrooms.
Yeah.
So I
Uh,
don't know what your thoughts are on this whole kind of criticizing.
well, Ollie,
this side of
as you
things?
know, there's the thing is the complicated nature of it is it's really easy to sneer, and because the reason it's easy is there's definitely a way to look at anything that's alternative, anything that's new, to put a shade over it, and to kind of suggest that, it's just people exploiting other people, which there's definitely that happens. Is definitely this thing now of certification. I think what we find with anything in all that's in the alternative spaces, whether it's NLP or hypnotherapy, or is that there are any number of bodies that can set themselves up and just say certificate. And this is what's happening now, just generally in the psychedelic sphere. A lot of these certificates of practice of psychotherapy mixed with psychedelics are kind of might become worthless if the whole kind of structure changes, and that we're suddenly developing psychedelics which are not, you don't have any need for psychotherapy. For
Yeah.
example, if someone studied Groffian psychotherapy, and then Stan Groff gets put into the box of being a cult leader, which again, we get into these complicated waters, because with all of these things, I've said, and I keep on repeating, that I've got a lot of time for Nashe, but she is one of those in that symposia group who are hugely critical, not just of maps, but
Hmm.
of Stan Groff's work and the potential for abuse that would come from that. But as you said, the potential for abuse can happen in institutions, and it's much harder to unpick in institutions because you're having to deal with the institutions, and the same with corporations and their lawyers. So I just think that some of those targets are soft targets.
Hmm.
And and I understand, my personal thing about microdosing is I don't particularly, I don't there's too much dovetailing with placebo. It's just too much where you're not sure, is it that's having the effect, or is it that, and if it wasn't for the fact that it can cost thousands, I would say give it a go. And if you've got enough money that you don't notice and you don't care, you can afford to lose that money, then it's a lifestyle. It's become a fashionable thing. I guess it's in America, it's fashionable. Here in the UK, obviously we have the issue with prohibition, and with the fact that they're still scheduled, these substances, and so we haven't even begun to explore that. But it feels to me that microdosing, much like whether it's in the alternative sphere or in the more conventional institutional spaces, um, they there's always going to be those who exploit for money. The nature of capitalism means that people are going to make claims and say that this can heal, or that this can have any number of benefits. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, then it's, well, maybe it didn't work for you. And, there's no real way of knowing absolutely. It's complicated, again, because a lot of the claims that are made, even from the science side of things, the medical side, is a little bit vague. We're not seeing an absolute pathway that this will definitely work for this number of people. It's just a variety of experiments and research. And so I can understand a comical thing. I can understand there is a lot of exploitation going around, people making the most of the situation and wanting to develop businesses. And there's a growing a growing industry, really, whether it's conventional or alternative. So, yeah,
I mean, this it's a really just to come back to a point that you made about the dovetailing with placebo. I think it's interesting that there's a lot of conversation about microdosing and, well, you're paying lots of money, you're having sub psychedelic doses, is it really doing anything? Does that mean then, if you are criticizing that, you have a duty to go after homeopathy or these other types of
Totally.
therapeutics where and then if you're not doing that, is it a case of, well, I didn't speak out for the homeopathy patients because I wasn't a homeopathy patient, you know? And
Yeah.
actually, if we do think, if people are really going to rail against the taking these small doses of something which might be doing something and people are wasting loads of money, then arguably we should be going after all these industries. And I guess maybe
That's what happened. But
that's not
that's
practical.
But
Mm,
that's what happened. That's what happened with homeopathy. That's what happened with chiropractor, you know,
mm,
practic. Um, there was a wave. Guardian was one of the main instigators of that, or certain
right,
journalists that were working for the Guardian at the time and other newspapers went in heavily on, the whole thing of homeopathy. It was, I think it was like a few million in the NHS budget. It was in the NHS budget,
right.
homeopathy for years, like since the 19th century, is when it
Mm,
started. There's the Royal Homeopathic Hospital, which was in Russell Square, near Russell Square.
yeah.
And I actually went along. I got referred when I was living in London. I actually had a GP
Right.
who referred me. And I tell you this, I walked into this beautiful clinic, relaxed, and I had a conversation with the doctor, and it was lovely. And it's like, this is the way a clinic should be. And I think even Richard Dawkins, when he visited a homeopathic hospital, he had the same came with the same conclusions. Well, perhaps the placebo is because you're treated so well that you feel seen and heard, and that may have a positive effect on your healing. Whatever the mechanism, and if there's no mechanism with homeopathy, it should be someone's choice. But there's a whole narrative, and this is what I talked about in my talk, and I'm developing a way to say it so that it's understood that it's narratives build, and one of the easiest narratives is the whole woo attack. You know,
Right.
you can attack what's her name with the Goop website,
Sure.
um, and it's this whole
Gwyneth.
thing, Gwyneth, and it's
Yeah.
this whole thing of like, look at these, and Marina Hyde does hatchet jobs on her all the time, and it's this
Yeah.
whole thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
the money that's being spent and all of this exploitation, and it's like you can do that, you can talk about that, but ultimately, what are we doing all this for? The criticism, you know,
Yeah.
the,
That's where I've come to is energetically wise. I'm like,
who cares?
it's got to the point now where I'm realizing this criticism, to be really blunt, it's not doing anything beneficial financially. You know,
Okay,
there's something like, okay, it's good to kind of get your name out there, but it's like, actually, if the industry is going in a way where it doesn't necessarily appreciate, or I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's like maybe there's ways which we haven't thought about to engage, which aren't so blanketly criticizing, which then might put people off, and
it
then it
depends.
further entrenches that feeling of being shut out. It's like, is there that kind of Taoist way of being like water going round a rock?
Yeah, yeah. There's all sorts of ways and means of diplomatically trying to put ideas forward and being very, very sophisticated about the way you present arguments, etc. It's possible. Whether that changes the power structures,
Mm,
I don't know.
mm.
Tom O'Neill did this piece on the
Yeah, yeah,
Manson,
yeah,
absolutely devastating, and he didn't take that extra step to say this is what happened. But
sure.
he left it in no uncertain terms that something was happening that is questionable at the very least. But
Mm,
if we were to take leaps, it wouldn't be so outrageous to say, my God, if it's worked that way in the 60s, if MK Ultra and all of these other, if these substances are used in some ways as weapons, if there were patsies, if there were ways to undermine what was an accidental, maybe growing youth rebellion using these psychedelics. Perhaps they were used as mind control, ways of undermining um, civil civil rights marches, etc., or revolution, actual revolution, challenging the American dominance and war in Vietnam, etc.
hmm
If it was, maybe. but maybe not. Maybe they were released and maybe they took on a life of their own with Leary. You know, again, people very quickly say, oh, Leary was part of a psyop as well. And suddenly you discount the fact that it may well have just been let out into the general population and have taken on a life of its own. And then it became too much and then maybe needed to undermine and suppress. Again, we can get into those territories and it gets away if we had to take a sober look at psychedelics were suppressed for 20 years. Some of the research went on underground anyway. Underground chemists, there was a counterculture. It was transgressive by nature. It was criminal. You know, these
Yeah.
people were you know, kind of underhand, underworld, whatever you want to call it, you know, doing their stuff. They did it for the good. Many of them believed they were doing it for the good. But then it starts to gain this legitimacy. Regardless of whether it's microdosing, not microdosing, it starts to get this legitimacy amongst the scientific institutions. It gives it, there's a bit of a sheen, the countercultural sheen. You know, you've got certain leading, you know, kind of parts of this scientific development. They might wear some funky tie, you
I
know,
just
they
that's
might.
literally as you're saying. There's some countercultural element. I'm just picturing a, a geeky scientist in a paisley shirt, sort of tokenistic paisley shirt.
Well, you know that there were one or two like that, you know, and then the others who were much straighter looking. And again, there's a cachet that came with, you know, investigating psychedelics, but very much down to MRI scans and, you know, all of this kind of really meticulous work on brain mapping.
What can we measure? We've got it
Well,
here.
yeah,
Look, look at it. It's here.
but no matter how many times you can, you know, kind of knock it, because it's the prevailing way that we understand the world that we're living in. You'll see in every newspaper, magazines, repeated, everyone saying fantastic talk and really made sense. And even people that you respect are saying that this is the science. Why would we want to discount the science? And this is the proper way to do it. And there'll be at the same time people continuing to doing medicine circles and, you know, kind of mixing in with it in indigenous knowledge. And some of those scientists are doing the same thing and they're picking up the cultural ways of respecting indigenous knowledge and, you know, reciprocity, and but up to a point, because the power structure of science, corporatism, and the way we live in the West, no matter it seems to be hurtling towards some kind of, you know, devastating conclusion, that's still seen as this is the best way. This is the only way we can do it. And if there are some things that go wrong, well, we've got a system of accountability and that's the institutions work. And eventually the bad guys will get caught up to. Whereas all of those, you know, kind of strange ways of doing things, you know, whether you're in a hut or someone calling themselves a shaman, you know, it's easy to see here and understandably so, but they're all byproducts of the system we're already living in, which has made it so difficult for regular people to just approach these substances in regular ways. You know, for me, microdosing is, why need to introduce that? I get it. A lot of people don't want to feel the psychedelic effect, you know, which is why we've got the science of take away the psychedelic element of it, and we can just have this healing substance, which is supposed to affect us chemically in a particular way. But we don't need that kind of, you know, spaced out, because a lot of people would not like that. So let's find a way to separate that. Microdosing is one way. Hey, as has been said by many on the left, it allows you to function as a member of society in the way that coffee allows you, and the way that alcohol on a weekend could allow you go out, have a few drinks, come back on a Monday, knock back some coffee, and you're a productive member of society. And microdosing is giving you that option of again being this highly
Mm.
functional. And what comes with that is this over obsession with the self again. You know, it's all about making us the perfect human being so that the best we can be. And it's this focus on that that gets away from this fact that this is my frustration. Take a look around. We've still got prohibition. We've still got lots of people with mental,
Absolutely.
you know, and how is that being addressed. Oh, you're just being impatient, Julio. You know, you've just got to wait. This is the way science works. This is the way protocols work. And I'm 58 years
I
old.
do, I do, I do
I've
find
been
that. I
banging on
do.
about this 30 years.
I
You know,
know. I mean,
sorry,
I've
it's
I've
just
had
frustrating.
I've I do feel your frustration there. I've had interactions with some of the psilocybin access rights people
Mm,
where I A try and talk about the other compounds that are in magic mushrooms besides psilocybin. So why the fuck are we just talking about psilocybin? And
yeah,
B, why are we not trying to access all drugs?
yeah.
And then when I start to bring this stuff up, I've had literally one of the people say, "Ollie, we've spoken about this before," and
Mm.
that is actually it's an infantilizing
What's it regarding what?
regarding my grievances surrounding just talking about psilocybin and just
Okay.
trying to get access for this one
Yes.
compound when we need access for all different types of substances. And when I
Yeah.
raise these questions, the response that I get is just, "Come on now, Ollie, we've spoken about this before."
Just
As if to say, we've spoken about this before, and my view is right, and you're the sort of
the irresponsible person.
fly in the ointment
Yeah. Oh,
outlier.
okay. Uh,
So
uh,
I, you know,
yeah. Ollie. So again, I mean, I could quite happily name names, but post Breaking Convention, I
mm,
caught up with a particular journalist there who's quite prominent in the field.
hmm
I made an effort to talk to the person and discuss a controversial subject about cancelling of a certain individual. I'm being as vague as possible. Let's
yeah,
not
yeah, yeah,
go there if we want, but um, the person kind of hectored me for a few minutes about why this person mustn't be platformed. And I just wasn't really platforming. I'm really talking about understanding what the atmosphere and the what's the word the climate is, and the way we can talk about these things. Because if we can't work through issues, anyway, I connected with this person online, and this person again is writing some sensationalist stories about ayahuasca, dodgy shamans. People could
hmm
probably work out who I'm talking about. It's
yeah,
one of a couple of the most prominent journalists. And I was a little bit, saying we want to be careful how these stories get narrativized. And
yeah,
an accomplished, brilliant journalist, because very, very capable journalists are in very big positions of power, just like with science, etc. These are well-educated people who have, talented, but the response I got was to tell me, if you talk to me in this way, I'm going to just switch off. And it was to me, a setting of the parameters of status. This
hmm
wasn't, I've been in this field one way or another, for good or ill, for 30 years.
yeah,
You're a young person. You might have done various medicine circles and spent time in South America and whatever. That's all very impressive. Anyone with money could do that. So
yeah,
there's nothing so way out. I'm not saying that I'm, the big I am, or that I did anything so countercultural, but for me, I just happened to grow up in that time, the whole rave
yeah,
time, where there was still a sense of, kind of the end of the Soviet Union. There was a sense of we as people, regular people, wanted to make these big changes. And that we could make these changes. Whereas what this journalist represents to me is someone who's very much within the power structure, and we are the only people who can be trusted to do this right, to analyze this right. And when I called that out, and unfortunately, as I say, I'm going to be, and I'm already feeling now like, oh, we'll stop recording, and I'll say, oh,
yeah.
I've said those things again, and that's going
No,
to upset
just
people.
I
You
think
just
we need
record it.
to because I personally think there is a and this is coming from my base as a non-journalist. I'm someone who's written a smattering of articles for publications, but I see a problem. I personally just have some grievances with psychedelic journalism because
It's journalism. Let
But
me butt in. Sorry,
yeah, yeah,
I just want to say I worked at the Times for five
yeah, yeah,
years. Worked at the Guardian for 5 years, and I'm from ostensibly a kind of working class North London background.
yeah,
Kind of. My parents owned their own house, so I wasn't like in an estate. So I'm not going to pretend again that it's more than it is. But walking into places like the Guardian and the Times, I'm very clear. And even when I walk into medical institutions, I'm very clear of the class differences.
sure.
So let's just say institutions. I was at Surrey Hospital when my mother was ill and trying to get help from the doc. But it's so stratified in the medical establishment. You've got the doctors, and they tend to be quite white and posh. Not always exclusively, but
Mm.
generally they've gone to good schools because they're the doctors. They've been able to go through college, and yes, anybody can theoretically if you're determined. But tendency is that people with money and a certain background, they're the doctors. Then there's the nurses, and they tend to be from working class backgrounds. Again, tend to be women, but not exclusively. But it's almost like that's the next strata down. You've got the corporate heads at the top.
Hmm.
But when you walk, and then you've got the cleaners and the receptionists,
Yeah.
etc., and they're the working class, you know, that the way those power structures are maintained, it's almost like a normalization. This is the way it is. When you try and challenge above your station, you can be put in place in
Oh
some
yeah.
very subtle ways,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, I found it so much engaging in the with the sort of corporate cannabis space and going along to, I've gone along to some networking events and just the it's funny, it is, non heads trying to put you in your place because they have assumed this position of power through their
and
financial capabilities. And then you
yeah,
think, okay, so this is what the game is. When I went along to that, the PAR thing with the Paul Stamets
mm,
soiree in the summer, I just thought, okay, I see what's happening. It's almost like a hostile business takeover where they just go, no, 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 we don't actually care that you've been engaging in these things in a very real, immediate, intimate sense, in a community centered. That doesn't actually mean anything because we're building an online community and we've got a subscription,
yeah,
and
and it will be successful.
and it will be
You know,
successful because we've got the branding.
it reminds you of that joke, and again, it's just, and it was at first it was a joke, and then it actually was said in Parliament by I think Boris Johnson or someone. It's like, oh well, we've we were very thankful to our Indian immigrant population to bring in curries and how to cook, and but now that we've learnt the recipe, do we really need you now?
Wow.
It's and that was said as a joke first on some comedy program, satirical program, but it's more or less when they were suggesting, kind of cutting off immigration
Yeah,
routes.
yeah, yeah.
It was almost as if to say this is the British national dish. Well, look, again, Ollie, I'm wary, and this is my own issue with how I sound and what people think. I'm always wary. I wrote an article at the Guardian about being working class working at the Guardian. The next
Mm,
day when I came, it was well received by people who read it. Lots of comments, but I was working on the comment desk at the
right.
time. They all came in and they made jokes about me being chippy, chip on my shoulder. Oh,
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
chippy, chippy. And it was all a little bit tongue in cheek, but it was all a little bit, you could feel
But it's
the
still there's the truth in that jibe, isn't there?
absolutely. And the thing is, you don't want to, me trying to be diplomatic, you don't want to make people feel bad for where they're born and how they grew up.
Sure.
Because no one can help that. But to pretend that it has no bearing, to pretend there isn't a class
Yeah.
differentiation, to pretend that this isn't what's happening, that this is kind of the psychedelics are being gentrified.
Hmm.
And part of gentrification is saying what's acceptable and not acceptable. It's very easy to
Yeah.
say we don't want that. We don't want crazy people doing crazy things. We don't
Yeah.
need any of that. But it kind of comes with the transgression. And it's not to justify it, it's to just say these things happen, and they happen because of the fundamental inequality in society, and people push
Exactly.
back. So
Um, I'm
how
just
about,
aware.
I know,
I'm aware we got 4 minutes left. So I
yeah,
just was thinking
w
if
w
there
we,
was something you wanted to kind of wrap up on, or
I've had a
where you
rant.
see, yeah, where you see the kind of positivity and room for
I think that the
collaborating with others and
yeah,
creativity and all these
I think that
positives.
because there was a sense, even in my talk and just generally, that there are so many people doing positive things who are you look at the work of Darren and
Hmm. Yeah,
Aquia, and
yeah,
that there are women that I know, friends who are doing work with Amanita, and
yeah,
that's become a thing. And there are many different modalities, psychotherapeutic modalities. I think there's so much hope, and maybe we focus too much on the negativity, um, when actually the fact that they've become these things that are being researched means that there is a legitimacy which is filtering through into the wider society.
yeah.
So it's a question of us finding ways to, as I said, I've gone off on my rant. That's the way I do it. I do get on, and I can get on even with those I disagree with. I'm just trying to say I'm not a complete nutter.
You're
you
not,
know
Giulio. You're not.
I know, but sometimes, you feel that thing of exclusion from spaces, and others have felt that.
Yeah,
I was
definitely.
I was fortunate to have been welcomed in. I've been going to Breaking Convention for many years. I had a really, really good conference. I enjoyed the talk, and I enjoyed talking to various different people. So there are lots of positives, but I just think that we shouldn't be blind to the power differentials that still exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I found a lot of positivity connecting with people in the US in the mushroom space, but also I have to remind myself those people have a lot more freedoms than we have in the UK, and being aware of the class differences in the UK and how that compares to other English speaking countries which are in the stages of normalizing psychedelics in whatever fashion that might be. All these countries aren't actually the same, and we need to recognize, okay, there are these differences, and where we have this kind of crossover with all the psychedelic culture, we also need to realize, okay, there's the structural inequalities of our different countries, and then within those countries that can create difficulties.
Yeah.
Um, we've got a minute. We've got a minute left. Is there anything you want to finish, or just shout out for your Substack?
Uh,
Where can people get in touch?
ravegeneration.substack.com.
Brilliant,
That's my Substack at the moment. And yeah, I mean, my talk will be out on YouTube soon. And yeah, let's keep chatting, Ollie. That's
brilliant.
all.
Let's do it, Julio. Nice one, amazing. Well, thanks. It's been great, and yeah, let's do it again soon.
Okay. Cheers.
All right, nice one, mate. Cheers.